All right, so I will go ahead, share my screen, and we will get started. Looks like some more people are filtering in, so we'll give them a chance. Make sure I have the chat up. Can everyone hear me okay? I did not ask that yet. I did bring a microphone and I'm hoping that it stayed on the correct setting from home. So feel free to use the chat if I need to put my volume up or down or anything, okay? All right. So today I will be talking to you all about Bachelor's Grove. My name's Kel. I'm one of the reference assistants at the Acorn Public Library. And we are going to start our talk with a bit of history on the Grove, go into what people experience in terms of hauntings, compare that with some folklore, and then if we have time at the end, do some Q&A and discussion, all right? I do want to just clarify, because time you talk about hauntings, I'm not going to tell you guys if ghosts are real. I'm not going to tell them if you're not real. If you're a believer or not, you're welcome in this discussion. So let's go ahead and dig in. Right, so a bit about me first as well. I'm kind of one of those people that was always into the paranormal. My friends and I were a bunch of weird kids. We did paranormal investigations growing up, ghost hunting, seances, all that kind of stuff. And it kind of led me to be a weird adult. I got my degree in religious studies and anthropology, kind of studied this academically, looking at folklore, comparative religions, why people believe the things they do, stuff like that. And Bachelor's Grove has kind of become my case study since I've graduated. So I do also want to give a quick disclaimer. During this research, I have noticed that people have some confusion about Bachelor's Grove. So I do want to say Bachelor's Grove is a part of the Cook County Forest Preserve. You are able to enjoy the trails sunset to sunrise like any other forest preserve, but if you are caught there after dark, you will be considered trespassing. The area is more strongly patrolled because of its history and reputation. So you are more likely to get caught out there if you do trespass. If your curiosity is really spiked and you did want to investigate after dark, that is something you just have to clear with the Village of Midlothian. I have not tried to do that myself, but the option is there. All right, so where is Bachelor's Grove? There are a lot of places around here called Bachelor's Grove, so I just want to clarify where we're talking about and how to get there if you haven't been there before. So Bachelor's Grove used to be part of a very big settlement. Pardon me, still admitting people, not quite used to having all the Zoom windows. So Bachelor's Grove used to be a part of a much larger settlement. We are going to be focusing on the cemetery area. And where that is directly across from what is now called Rubio Woods. So if you want to get there, Rubio Woods is kind of right where 143rd turns into Midlothian Turnpike. You will use that parking lot and then go across the very busy 143rd Street and aim for the power stations. And there's a little rundown trail that takes you to the equally rundown remains of the old Midlothian Turnpike. Walk down that for about a half mile and you reach what's left of the cemetery. All right. So the history of the Grove. So the Bachelor's Grove settlement was founded in the 1830s and comprised of a lot of land that's now Bremen Township, Tinley Park, Oak Forest, Midlothian, and Crestwood. The trade of choice was timber. The cemetery itself was founded around 1844 and was originally known as the Everton Cemetery because that was the family that owned the land. As we get closer to the Civil War, we see more and more families start to leave these settlements for more established towns. Stuff that used to be the Bachelor's Grove settlement is now New Bremen, which would now be known as Tinley Park. And it just, or even people are starting to move, further west, California, all that kind of stuff. And it starts to really lose population. So by the time we get to the 1900s, the area is actually already pretty empty. pretty much the most notable thing there is in 1909, Christian Boehm dug a quarry site, which operated until the mid-20s, and even then kind of run down as a stone quarry that wasn't super successful. And that land eventually was sold and became part of the Cook County Forest Preserve. So if you didn't actually know that, a lot of these forests are what's known as second growth forests because they were cut down from the timber trade. And then, the Forest Preserve was like, we should probably restore some of our forests. So if you're ever walking around, it's actually not uncommon to see remains of wells, remains of foundations, all that kind of stuff. And Bachelor's Grove is no exception. So when it becomes part of the Forest Preserve, it's already been kind of isolated for a while. So as early as the 30s, you start seeing people start to sneak into what remains of the cemetery, what remains of the woods, and kind of becomes a little bit of a lover's lane. And you start hearing ghost stories start to crop up. But where Bachelor's Grove really gets its history and its infamy is from pretty much through the 50s through the 70s. So basically what ends up happening here is that the parts of the Midlothian Turnpike, which is that road that runs right next to the cemetery, start getting closed off. They start getting rerouted to other roads and stuff like that. So Bachelor's Grove becomes a very incredibly isolated place. And as a result, something that people were already starting to use as a little bit of a lover's lane is now a full-on like party site. People are, drinking there, drugs, all that kind of stuff, bonfires, they're leaving their trash everywhere. And also there's a lot of vandalism that starts to crop up, and it gets pretty intense. So gravestones regularly get knocked down and stolen, to the point it's believed that actually at some point almost every police department in the Chicago suburbs had a piece of one of the stolen headstones. They would put them back, they'd get stolen again. It was a vicious cycle. At one point in 1959, the original 500-pound gates to the cemetery were actually stolen. No one knows where they went, anything like that. It was just kind of a vicious cycle of vandalism between partygoers and the police. And probably what's most horrific though is that there are cases of people digging up coffins in this cemetery and displaying bones and the like. So this kept going on, and eventually in 1976 the land is considered condemned, and in 1977 it gets the county actually takes control of it from the Forest Preserve. They put up a barbed wire fence. Still gets broken into, but it pretty much became this is a weird place we want to just lock down because so much is going on here. So it's no surprise that when you have all of this, graffiti, grave desecration, all this stuff, that's where we really start to see Bachelor's Grove gain its reputation as most haunted cemetery in Chicago, most haunted cemetery in the US. So along with all of the vandalism news clippings around Halloween, you would also see all these clippings about, oh, let's go ghost hunting in Bachelor's Grove, stuff like that. I will say Bachelor's Grove today is better than it was in the 70s. It does still experience graffiti, but it's not to the extent that it was in the 50s and 70s or anything like that. And part of that is actually because of a wonderful thing called the Bachelor's Grove Restoration Project, which was established in 1998. And basically they did work to help, restore the Grove, beautify it, anything like that. Unfortunately, you do also still see homelessness activity in the Forest Preserve, Bachelor's Groves included. So that is another thing to watch out for if you are hiking. But what's actually really cool is that, by this point, it is well ingrained in the public's imagination of, Bachelor's Grove is in all the ghost books, it's in all the Chicago ghost books. Anyone who's talking about haunted locations talks about Bachelor's Groves at this point. To the point that in 2012, the cemetery is actually even featured on Ghost Adventures, which is one of the longest running and more successful paranormal television shows today. Personally, cannot believe that I have to tell you that Ghost Adventures is historically significant, but here we are. And it wouldn't surprise me that because shows like this, usually you see a hype increase in the area of oh, it was on TV, we got to go see it. People, from the surrounding states go see it. That actually in 2014, the Grove Restoration Project ceases because the Forest Preserve District presumes taking care of it. So now, on Ghost Adventures, if you watch the old episode, it's super overgrown. It's a mess to walk in there, even when it's the day. And now it's much closer to that picture on the top right, where it's actually well maintained, it's mowed. And it looks a lot less creepy as a result. So it does also seem to be a lot more appreciated now with the groundskeeping. It's also not uncommon now to find offerings of like coins, flowers, and people kind of just appreciating the space more. So now that the history, we've got some grounding in the history, let's talk a bit about the hauntings. There's so much to talk about with hauntings. There's so many encounters, so I'm just only going to focus on some of the major ones. So probably one of the most famous pieces of Bachelor's Grove haunting is this photo of Madonna of Bachelor's Grove, also known as the Woman in White. Again, not going to tell you this photo is real or not, but it is in like every ghost book under Bachelor's Grove. People share it all the time as like an iconic ghost photo, and it's kind of captured the public's imagination. So this photo was taken by Judy Huff Feltz in 1991. And it's actually, normally you see this zoomed in photo, but that's actually part of a much larger set seen on the right. And when people talk about the woman in white, they usually talk about a very sad woman, you know, she's crying, she is either holding a baby, looking for her child, something around that. And that seems to come from these two gravestones that are super prominent in Bachelor's Grove. That is the Fulton Stone and the Infant Daughter Stone. And these stones are of the Fulton family. So there are several people, you know, associated with the larger gravestone. And then the smaller gravestone is for Marcy May Fulton. And definitely as soon as you walk in, there's not a lot of gravestones still standing there. So this one definitely stands out. And as a result, people tend to leave a lot of offerings and trinkets, especially for the little girl. Even when they get cleaned off, they always come back. And it's kind of helped fuel this legend of the Madonna of Bachelor's Grove. The next one is the Phantom House, picture not included. I'm hesitant to call this one a ghost, but it's something that's so frequently reported by people that it gets called the Disappearing House, the Magic House, the Phantom House. And its descriptions are actually pretty consistent over the years. People usually talk about either a 1 or 2 story white farmhouse. It's got a porch swing and a light in one of the windows. And the windows kind of have that very like stereotypical kind of like crossbar look. So when people try to go after it, it either like gets smaller, it gets further away, it disappears. And like I said, there are still some foundation remains in the actual woods around the cemetery. But what's interesting about this is that no one really reports the house in the same place. It seems to move around. And honestly, I do not think they had model versions of like suburbs like we have today. So very interesting that the descriptions still line up. Then there's also the pond, or the fetid pond, the smelly, gross kind of like, I do not want to touch that pond. And there are 2 main stories that come out of this. The first is that this used to be a mafia dumping site, you know, used by Al Capone when you'd go out in the suburbs and stuff. You know, people talk about an apparition of someone dragging a body. What's interesting though is there's never actually been any confirmation of anyone, you know, finding any bodies actually dumped in there. There have been deaths around the Grove. There's actually a mafia hit found not too far from where Bachelor's Grove is, but at this point in history, this was kind of the time when the Chicago mob kind of like to show off their victims more than hide them. We weren't really the like cement shoes types at that point in time. The other main story is the horse and the farmer. So people will see a horse come out of the pond, and then a plow, and then a farmer. And the old legend is that in the 1870s, a horse and farmer slipped into the pond and drowned, and no one could help them. That doesn't really line up because that pond didn't exist until 1909 when the quarry was built. And even then it wasn't filled in until the 20s. So it doesn't exactly line up with history, but it is still like a story that everyone talks about. And the other activity I wanted to talk about is the woods. So Adam Seltzer, who is the author of Ghosts of Chicago, really captured a lot of the sentiment of what goes on in the woods with the quote, he talks about how the cemetery itself feels very pleasant. The woods, though, can be another matter. It's spookier in there than it is in the graveyard, and I always seem to get lost out there. And this actually captures a lot of what people experience in the Grove. There's that long, you know, remains of Midlothian Turnpike that you walk to get to the cemetery. Some people talk about how there's the guardian of the Grove is there. You know, they watch you and kind of like assess who you are, or like people report, you know, oh, I think I've had like stuff thrown at me, stuff like that. And then a lot of people also report strange lights in the woods, and this is during the day and during at night. And these can be different colors, you know, white, green, red, blue, different sizes. They move through the woods. You can't hear them. They follow you. They chase you. And what's very interesting is that if people follow them, there's also a lot of stories of people getting lost in the woods. Now, Bachelor's Grove isn't that big. It's, I think, like 4 square acres. So if you walk in one direction for long enough, you're gonna, you know, either hear the road, see the road. So people just kind of getting turned around is something that's always very interesting when you are in realistically a smaller space. People also report hooded figures. Sometimes they associate those with the guardian, phantom dogs, phantom cars. All of this stuff seems to be like in the woods itself. Disappearing house, also in the woods, stuff like that. So not only do you have a haunted cemetery, you kind of got the whole area is all haunted as well. So how exactly does a place become haunted? Many stories I shared with you are actually incredibly common experiences across people, you know, reporting over, at this point, like decades of reports, generations, you know, these are grandparents, parents, and their kids saying the same things. And yet, you know, they don't always line up with a historical record. You know, I can't tell you that there was a horse and a farmer in the 1870s. I can't tell you, you know, no, the mob didn't, you know, put bodies in the pond, but again, we keep telling these stories, and it seems like what makes a haunted location, what draws people to it, is isolation and liminality. So liminality is basically an in-between state, and many haunted locations fall under this description. You know, buildings that are no longer used but are torn down, you know, or not torn down, so they just sit abandoned. You know, think of, you know, our abandoned prisons, mental asylums, stuff like that. And that's basically Bachelor's Grove. When the Forest Preserve took it, it was already pretty empty, and it's just become kind of even more abandoned ever since, especially when no one was taking care of it. You know, yeah, and then, you know, you have the stereotypical things of like burial grounds are supposed to be these very sacred spaces, regardless of your tradition, and you see just so much, you know, desecration that happened there. You know, headstones stolen, you know, all the graffiti, it just doesn't feel like if you went to, you know, a nicer cemetery of what you'd expect to find there. So these kind of occurrences already kind of have people thinking about, oh, this place is haunted. Oh, something has to be going on here. And then combine that with, there's also something called pareidolia. So that's basically like the human brain is very good at making patterns out of randomness. You know, if you've ever stared at like a speckled ceiling and you start to see shapes, that's kind of what pareidolia is. But when you're freaked out, sometimes that can also look like freaky things, you know, especially if you're in the woods, you're hearing weird sounds. You know, there's a bunch of stuff like foxes. If you've ever heard foxes cry, sound like a baby crying, like weird stuff like that, that can help fuel the imagination. And what's great about ghost stories is that they actually line up a lot with each other, like cross-culturally. So Bachelor's Grove's a great example actually of this. So the Madonna of Bachelor's Grove is not our only woman in white. The woman in white is actually a super common ghost, if not the most common ghost when we're looking at these stories. There are even more around Chicago, from Resurrection Mary, who she's the hitchhiker ghost, to jog your memory on that, or the Weeping Woman of Archer Woods. You know, people go up, you know, see if she's okay, and then she's just gone. Or even a possible ancestor of the woman in white is what's known as the Banshee, which you might know as the Banshee, which is, you know, a type of spirit, you know, that would be talked about in like Ireland and stuff like that, where she'd be cloaked in gray or white, and she was considered an omen of death coming to your family. But she was actually thought of, some sources talk about, oh, banshees are made by women who die in childbirth, they become banshees, or women who lose their families in tragedies, they become banshees. So you see these common themes, you know, Our Madonna Bachelor's Grove, usually associated with, looking for her daughter. Not that uncommon of a story. It also relates to a lot of fairy folklore. So when I talk about fairies here, I'm not talking about Tinkerbell. Fairy was actually kind of used as a overarching term for a bunch of different kind of spirits. And some of those were usually associated with the woods. So you have will-o-wisps that were lights in the woods that would lead travelers astray, sometimes just to mess with them, or sometimes even leading them to their doom. And they would come in various colors, just like the lights in Bachelor's Grove. People would have various charms to prevent you from being something called fairy-led. You turn your clothes inside out so the fairies can't help you make you get lost in the woods, stuff like that. So it's very interesting, all of these stories, even if people had never heard of fairy folklore or anything like that, they line up with stories that we've been telling for generations. And it also shares theme with modern folklore. It has its own like dead boyfriend and hook-handed killer story. I'm sure you've heard the one of, a boyfriend and a girlfriend are sitting in their car and, the girl feels uneasy. She wants to go home. The guy leaves and, he doesn't come back. So, she gets out of the car and the police are like, I'm sorry, but he's gone, or they drive home and they open the door and the hook's on it. Bachelor's Grove has those too, which is so interesting that they all get localized. That's all over the US, it's all over the UK. So what does it all mean? Why does it matter? Yeah, we just like getting scared, right? It's just a ghost story, it doesn't matter if people aren't original, right? Well, ghost stories are actually a really important part of communal myth making and community building. We love telling stories as people, we love passing them on, and ghost stories are a great example of this. There was a study done in 2005 that actually looked at how young people from adolescence to college age used ghost stories like Bloody Mary and other kind of like traumatic ghost stories meant to scare you, as a process of transitioning, helping them transition into adulthood and confront trauma and kind of just work things out in a fun way. So if you have a sibling that was really mean and maybe had you do Bloody Mary and then like ran and shut the door, maybe you can bring them up at Thanksgiving dinner of like, hey, there's actually science behind why you did that, I guess, or just pass the casserole. I don't know, up to you. It also serves as a way for us to pass on stories for the next generation. Remember history, it's parents telling stories to their kids of like, oh, you think you're cool going to Bachelor's Grove. I went to Bachelor's Grove when I was a kid, and this is what happened to me. Or it's how we, keep our history. So many of these stories have been told since like the 30s, and that's getting close to 100 years. So that's pretty cool. And I in summary, it also talks about our fears and anxieties. Colin Dickey, who wrote the book Ghostland, which is an excellent study on the topic, talks about how our country's ghosts themselves are dreams or nightmares of a nation, the Freudian slip of whole communities, uncomfortable and unbidden expressions of things we'd assume were long past and no longer important. The history of America's ghosts is one of crimes left unsolved or transgressions we now feel guilty about. And I actually think that kind of cultural processing that ghost stories can kind of help us do is perfect, example of what happens in Bachelor's Grove. You have an abandoned memorial of some of our earliest history in the area. Bachelor's Grove settlement existed before Tinley Park, before Oak Forest. It is the land that I'm sure a lot of us are, living on today. But it was left and it was vandalized. It has stories of ghosts tied to tragic deaths, still talking about Chicago's association with the mob, or tragedies that happen, in the woods, women being lost too soon, stuff like that. And even the stories that our ancestors seem to have taken with them, and seeing those common themes. So that's Bachelor's Grove. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope I didn't give you flashbacks to dull lectures in school. And I do want to say, if anyone's interested in learning more, probably the best immediate resources I could give you for Bachelor's Grove is the bachelorsgrove.com website. I'm not affiliated with them, but as someone going through library school and having to do research, they kind of blew me away with how detailed they are, all their photos, all their documents. They seem to have it, down to a T. If you have any other more specific interests, then I could definitely try to give some recommendations as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and check our time. We are at 7:27. So if anyone would like to ask questions, talk, that's definitely something we could do. All right, and if you wanted to, you could pop questions in chat, or you could, yeah. Oh, thank you, Colleen. Good, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope I did not talk too fast. I have not done public speaking for a little bit, so I feel like I might have been cruising a bit.
Can we ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Who did you say owned the land in the original?
So Bachelor's Grove was a very big settlement. So there were a lot of local landowners, but there wasn't like a mayor of Bachelor's Grove or anything. What we seem to happen is that people were going there because there was a lot of timber, kind of became a settlement, and then eventually, you know, towns like Tinley Park started to develop, Bremen Township developed, stuff like that. And that's where people kind of started splitting off, being like, I don't really feel like doing timber anymore. Let's actually settle down.
So there was no family that particularly owned it.
You know, there were a lot of influential families in the area. The Fultons, who had that big gravestone, are one of them. The Everdens were one of them, but it's kind of a weird period of history that sometimes it's hard to track what happened to those families. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And if you are interested in anyone who maybe is buried there, that definitely the Bachelor's Grove website has actually all the cemetery records and plot information too. Jackie asked, do the police really care about people going there? Yes, I think it is more of the park rangers, but especially because of like all the vandalism like through the 70s, a little bit in the 80s too, and the vandalism that still happens, like definitely it's something that they're aware of. So why didn't anyone purchase the abandoned farms? So actually, in the 20s is when the Forest Preserve just started buying the land. So that's actually who was buying the land when they didn't want it. They were offering money to these families of like, hey, we're looking into the Forest Preserve. We will buy your land from you. And most people were like, yeah, sure, I'll just go, you know, move a few towns down, or I'll go, you know, to a different state, anything like that. So what time would be best to go if we want to see something paranormal? People actually report activity at all times of day. So I, you know, do a bit of investigation there too. My friends we all have stories like from broad daylight, you know, 80 degrees, noon, doesn't usually feel that spooky, but people still experience stuff. All right, does anyone else have questions? You can ask, you can type in chat.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, there's a paranormal outfit called Spectre Waves locally here in Oak Forest. And the gentleman who I was talking to that runs it with his wife said that they had various devices like Ghost Adventures to try and see if they heard anything. And they kind of got frustrated. And when they were leaving, he, for joking purposes, said, would anyone like to come out and play? And then they packed up and left. And he heard a faint voice saying no. So if you look at search for Spectre Waves, he's got that online for what it's worth.
Sure. And the Bachelor's Grove website does also keep Google documents of everything that people experience. I know a lot of people who try to do recordings there do get frustrated because when you are in the cemetery, you can still hear the busy roads. So that does impact it. In the woods, it's a little bit better. It's a little bit more muffled, but then you also have, you know, wood sound that can, I know a lot of people who do EVP work or recording, you know, get frustrated at that kind of thing. So that's not surprising. Paranormal investigators, you know, any location that's haunted, also, you know, pretty common for people to talk about, oh, my battery's drained, or, oh, it doesn't, you know, nothing seemed to work right, even though I tested it. And that just seems to be a trend in like paranormal stuff in general, of like the technology never works when you want it to. What paranormal things have I seen? So when I do investigation, personally, like something I like to do is called the Estes method. So I actually don't see anything. Basically, you take a spirit box, some soundproof headphones, connect them to the spirit box and a blindfold. You have that spirit box running. If you don't know what that is, that's basically kind of like, it's a broken radio that sweeps channels really fast, so it just makes white noise. So that's usually what I'm under, and people are asking questions, and I'm trying to hear anything and, you know, see if that lines up with any encounters. It kind of creates a blind situation.
There was a presentation on Bachelor's Grove at Acorn 2 or 3 years ago by author Ursula Bilski, who wrote that Bachelor's Grove history book. And she mentioned doing tours going through there a couple of years ago. When I contacted her, she said she had stopped. I guess she was running into problems doing it. Do you know if she's back doing those?
I do not know Ursula personally. I did read her book for this presentation. It is in the references. I don't know if that was just an issue with the village or anything like that, but you do usually see around Halloween someone trying to do an event. But also we are still in COVID time, so I know events have just been kind of messed up as well. I think she spoke in 2016 here, if I'm remembering right.
Someone at my house wanted to know if you would consider getting a tour together through Acorn.
I would have to ask about that. It is something interesting. I don't know if I'd be able to do it. I actually I injured my knee last year, so like hiking tends to lay me up in bed for a few days, but I would be interested in doing it should weather provide, if that's something I'm able to do. So I'll inquire about that if people are interested.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? If not, that is perfectly okay. I do hope that you found this interesting, learned something you didn't before. Yeah, and I enjoyed doing this for all of you. Yeah, so you're welcome.
Thank you. I think you did
of course.
Job and got a lot of information out there. I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, and they gave me permission to do programming, and I was like, all right, you're gonna get the weirdest thing I can think of off the top of my head. So they let me do it. So, all right, I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Like I said, I will stick around for questions, but you are not obligated to stay in the room if you have other things to do. If you have Netflix to catch up on, I will not be offended.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, everyone.